What do you gain by using ACES? Advantage 1. Color consistency. ACES includes a huge variety of color space transforms, which are not provided in the default OCIO. Using these transforms as IDTs makes it very easy to match colors across multiple different footage sources. But don't get me wrong, it's good practice anyway to use a color checker instead to verify that your colors are matching. Additionally, using a color checker will also help you to make tweaks if they should become necessary. Advantage number 2. Working and rendering color spaces. ACES provides some of the best color spaces for the purpose of working or rendering. Using these color spaces for their designated tasks helps preserve as much data as possible from your inputs, while also increasing the accuracy of the calculations themselves. Here's an example of what it can look like to use ACES CG as a rendering color space instead of the default one, which is linear sRGB. This image alone doesn't do a very good job of representing the benefits of using ACES CG as a rendering space, but I'm afraid talking about it in more detail would quickly become too technical, even for my standards. However, if you're interested in a detailed breakdown of ACES, including the benefits and room for improvements, I can only recommend you to read this article. It's part of a free online book, which I consider to be one of the best resources currently available. Links to the article and book can be found in the video description. Advantage number 3. ODTs. Most screens are not only heavily constrained in terms of their color range, but also regarding their contrast or dynamic range. And the same is true for the color spaces they use, as there is no point in storing and transmitting data that won't be displayed anyway. ACES provides high-quality output device transforms that do a better job at preserving a natural feeling while transferring the wide gamut high dynamic range data from your working and rendering color spaces to your output color space. Be aware that these ODTs are designed to be visually pleasing and not to accurately represent data. This can lead to some unexpected behavior, but more about that in a minute. Comparing these two images, you can see that the main difference is how ACES deals with the highlights. I'm going to explain the mechanisms behind this using the values of the output sRGB ODT. Values darker or equal to 1.0 are scaled down to fit in the 0 to 0.81 range. The remaining 19% gained at the top end of the brightness curve are then used to display all the values between 1.0 and 18.9. This method produces much cleaner looking highlights. It also has the side effect of our overall image looking darker. In my opinion, the image turns out too dark, but luckily there are multiple ways we can fix this. The first option is to fix it in comp, but that's far away from perfect, especially for the look dev artists. The second option is to use a different ODT. This option is particularly handy if you're creating content which is intended for sRGB devices only, such as any personal project that will end up somewhere on the internet. Since sRGB and Rec 709 only differ in terms of their transfer function, or in other words, their brightness response, we can use the ODT intended for Rec 709, even though we are working on an sRGB display. This lifts up the shadows, producing a, in my opinion, much better result. If you're generating content for other platforms than sRGB, you will either have to use option 1, or you can find or create a different set of ODTs to use. Side note, I've sometimes seen people call Filmic Blender's version of ACES. However, this isn't really true. Filmic doesn't have the large variety of input transforms, and it still uses the default rendering space. The only aspect Filmic and ACES have in common is using similarly fashioned ODTs. But at least in my opinion, ACES does a better job at this too. Which software packages support ACES? Software packages can be grouped into 3 categories, depending on their ACES support. Those that ship with ACES, even though you might have to manually enable it, those that support ACES but don't ship with it, and those without proper ACES support. Be aware that this list is incomplete, as I've only included those software packages that I've already tried using ACES with myself. Also notice that some software packages make it easier than others for you to install ACES. Blender, for example, is a lot more difficult than Maya. Which color space should I use for a specific task? Let's start by establishing the main criteria for each type of task. After that, we'll go through a bunch of color spaces and the tasks they are optimized for. Rendering, compositing, and texturing rely on a linear transfer function to have accurate calculations. Additionally, a wide gamut would be ideal in order to avoid clipping, even if you're not using a screen that can display such a wide gamut. Unlike rendering and compositing, most color correction algorithms are artistic and not physically based, with the exception being gain or exposure. Instead of using linear transfer functions, color grading tools are mostly based on a logarithmic or short log transfer function. Professional cameras often utilize log transfer functions as well, with some of the most popular ones being Cineon by Kodak, S-Log by Sony, and Log-C by Arri. Cineon is the oldest of the three and had a big impact on shaping both grading algorithms and other log curves. S-Log and Log-C, for example, are often described as Cineon-like. In addition to a logarithmic transfer function, we would also want to use a wide gamut in order to avoid clipping our color range. Archiving and interchange. The purpose of archiving is of course to avoid any data loss. The most important factor for this is that it should not clip the color or brightness range. To ensure that this is the case, it is necessary to cover the full range of colors visible to the average human eye. And while a linear transfer function is not really necessary, it does make future conversions a bit easier. Another important factor for archiving standards is to use 32-bit floating point files. This ensures high color precision and eliminates the risk of clipping your brightness. Display or output. The main criteria of a color space for your final output is that it matches the device that it is viewed on. This ensures that the data will look correct without any additional conversions, and that you are not wasting any values which couldn't be displayed anyway. Typically, color spaces of this category use a nonlinear transfer function and a narrow gamut. Alright, now that we've covered the most important tasks, let's get an overview of the most important color spaces. But before we can do so, I need to clarify one more thing. The word ACES is often used in an ambiguous way, as people use it both to refer to the color pipeline as well to a specific color space, such as ACES 2065-1, ACES CG, or ACES CC. To avoid confusion, I'm using the full names of the color spaces, and I encourage you to do the same. Whenever I'm using the word ACES without any addition, I'm referring to the color pipeline, and not an individual color space. Rec. 709 and sRGB. These two color spaces are the ones used by most consumer-grade products. Rec. 709 is the standard for HD TV and can mostly be found in TV screens, while sRGB is dominating the computer display market. Both color spaces share the same gamut and have nonlinear transfer functions. While these transfer functions are quite similar to each other, they are not an exact match. While neither of them should be used as a working or rendering color space, each of them could be the target color space of your final output. Linear Rec. 709 or sRGB. This color space has many different names depending on the software and OCIO config you are using. Linear Rec. 709/sRGB is the name given to it by Maya, while the default ACES config refers to it as Utility Linear sRGB or Lin sRGB if you're using the alias. Other software packages such as Nuke's OCIO config, which is also used by Mari, use the worst possible name, as they simply call it linear. This mix of names can be very confusing, especially since linear is a description of a transfer function and not an appropriate name for a color space. Linear Rec. 709/sRGB uses the same gamut as sRGB and Rec. 709, but has a linear transfer function. Linear sRGB is the default rendering color space of most software, including, but not limited to, Substance, Nuke, Blender, and most versions of Maya before Maya 2022. This isn't the worst possible option, since it at least has a linear transfer function, but the extreme clipping of the gamut is a big downside. ACES 2065-1. The primaries that define the gamut of this color space are known as AP0 and cover the full range of colors visible to the average human eye. Besides its very wide gamut, ACES 2065-1 has a linear transfer function. In visual effects, it's commonly used as the interchange and archiving color space. Earlier we established that you should also have a linear transfer function and a wide gamut for rendering and compositing, so surely this is the color space we would want to use for that, right? Well, not quite. The extremely wide gamut is both the biggest strength and biggest weakness of ACES 2065-1. A large part of the gamut is designated to imaginary colors. Using it as a working or rendering space would simply be a waste of resources. Another issue is that negative values had to be used to define AP0's blue primary in order to provide 100% coverage. And using negative values for your primaries can break the energy conservation of your scene. If you're not familiar with the term energy conservation, don't worry. It simply means that no light magically appears where it shouldn't. A surface can never reflect more light than it receives. If it does, you're breaking energy conservation. To counter this issue, a new set of primaries was developed. These primaries are known as AP1 and are used for all ACES color spaces except for ACES 2065-1. AP1 primaries still cover a large part of the CIE standard observer gamut, but unlike AP0, they don't require negative values and barely include any imaginary colors. ACES CG. As the name tells us, ACES CG is optimized for computer graphics and uses the AP1 primaries. This way, ACES CG is able to get an extremely wide gamut without breaking energy conservation. Additionally, ACES uses the linear transfer function, which is exactly what we want for rendering, compositing, and texturing. ACES CC and ACES CCT. ACES CC is optimized for color correction and also uses AP1 primaries, just like ACES CG. The difference between them is that ACES CC uses a logarithmic transfer function. There also is a variation of this color space called ACES CCT, which makes it a little bit easier to deal with very extreme shadows. However, this can cause compatibility issues with ACES Proxy, which is an integer version of ACES CC created specifically for data transport to devices that don't support floating point data. RAW. While RAW is not really a color space, it is important to talk about it. Selecting RAW as your color space tells the color pipeline to skip all color conversions for this file. This is what we need to use for any data textures such as roughness, normals, or displacements. It won't matter which rendering space you are using, the input data will always stay as it is. This concludes all the color space options I'm using for my personal artwork, and I won't be using any others in my workflow demonstration in part 3. However, a few honorable mentions have to be made, as they might be important for you. DCI-P3. This color space has a significantly wider gamut than Rec. 709, but not quite as wide as ACES CG. It is commonly used by projectors in movie theaters, and a variation of it seems to become the new standard for displays built into Apple products, including iPhones, Macs, and iPads. But this trend also seems to catch on amongst other products. Most professional reference monitors are able to display DCI-P3, but depending on the goal of your production, you might be mastering in Rec. 709 anyway. Rec. 2020. The gamut of this color space is almost as wide as the AP1 primaries used by ACES CG, and it uses the same transfer function as Rec. 709. This color space defines the color specifications used by UHD HDR displays. But while HDR displays are becoming more and more popular among users, most video productions are still mastering their footage in Rec. 709. The reason for this being that most HDR panels on the market do not meet the requirements to be used as a reference display. What is mastering? I used this term a couple of times when explaining all the color spaces, so what the hell is it? Mastering is simply the process of optimizing your data for your final output device, whether it's video, music, or something completely different. In relation to color spaces, it means to optimize your final output using a device that is able to display your target color space and is also calibrated to do so. Your target color space depends on which project your output is meant to be viewed on. If you're working on a personal project, which you're going to post online, then your target color space is typically sRGB. I assume that most people watching this video are texturing, shading, lighting artists, or something similar. If this is true for you, then you will probably never be tasked to master anything. Your screen will be set up by somebody else, and all you'll ever be mastering for will be your own online content.